Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's 5x15. On this spring evening, we have a real treat in store for you. 5 brilliant speakers with 5 very different stories to tell, stories that offer us new ways of thinking about the world that we live in. Don't forget that our speakers' books are on sale tonight through our independent bookselling partner, Newham Bookshop, and information will be posted about those in the chat, so please keep your eyes peeled. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Anne-Marie Imafidon, who aged 11 was the youngest girl ever to pass her A-level computing. She was just 20 years old when she received her master's degree in maths and computer science from Oxford. And since then, she's held positions at Goldman Sachs, Hewlett-Packard, and Deutsche Bank, as well as honorary doctorates from numerous universities. She co-founded STEMETS in 2013, an award-winning social initiative dedicated to inspiring and promoting the next generation of young women in STEM. In her new book, She's in Control, Anne-Marie offers a guidebook for women to take back tech. We're so pleased to have her with us tonight. Anne-Marie, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jack, and I'm rising to the challenge that we have on time today. So this is a whistle-stop tour of how to tech control based on, as you heard there from Jack, my upcoming book, She's in Control. And now this is a story that starts very much with me aged 4 years old, a couple of years ago, and a young girl, a young person, someone who just entered into the world and was incredibly curious about the things that were around her, the way that they worked. One of my earliest memories is of our VCR player that we had at home. So if any of you remember VCR players, we had them before DVD players, that we had before Blu-ray, that we had before Netflix. And I remember being fascinated by little cassette tapes and wondering, how they were able to reliably show Timon and Pumbaa again and again, despite them not being on the sticker, on the Lion King sticker on the cassette tape. And so after taking apart a cassette tape, and not finding the answers I was looking for, I took apart our VCR player, and I'm very, very thankful that my parents didn't kill me. But that curiosity and that sense of discovery and wanting to understand how things work, I didn't realise was me tapping into technology as I knew it, as it was there in the 1990s. And this is a journey of discovery, fewer things that I'm breaking these days and taking apart, but a journey of discovery that has led me to many weird and wonderful spaces, whether that's meeting her late Majesty, the Queen at Buckingham Palace, whether that's appearing on Countdown as a arithmetician for a large number of episodes last year, or just actually having the podcast and writing things like this book. They're not all things that I would have imagined that I would have been doing, but by virtue of this exploration of tech, is something that has ended up happening. And for me, this has been a journey of also discovery and of influencing what happens next, which I wonder how often we get to reflect on the future, on our legacy, but also the way that the decisions that we make today and the norms that we have now might influence what happens next. And I wonder, those of you that are tuning in, how often you've got to think ahead, maybe 10, 20 or 30 years beyond just maybe next year or tomorrow, or 5 years time on, in your career or on the next big project that you're working on. When you think that far ahead, what is it that you imagine? This is a Guardians of the Galaxy S-type scenario with flying cars and something that looks a little bit like the Burj Khalifa. And can you really do a tech talk these days without talking about AI and what the robots think the future is going to look like? And I'll let you decide which of these is 20 years or which is 30 years into the future, because apparently there's a difference between the two. But I think it's always interesting and intriguing to understand a little bit more about what might happen next based on what we imagine now. And actually the future might feel far away, but there are clues as to what happens next that we can see across many of the tech trends we have today, but also our own imaginations. Now, this is something I get to reflect on with audiences fairly often. The idea of Knight Rider and a guy called Michael in the 1980s talking to his car Kit and being able to solve crime successfully with this car was but a science fiction, but an idea, but a part of someone's imagination that not too long afterwards has now become a reality. And there's so much of what we have now and what is created and this one weird and wonderful, sometimes inaccessible world of tech that comes from imaginations, but also the adding together of these different concepts and these ideas, these tech trends like virtual reality, autonomous vehicles or robots. They're all big words that are often ones that we fear and ones that different folks fear, but they're big words and big tech trends that are leading us to a future where we still haven't necessarily learnt some of the lessons that have got us to this point. And this is what I get to explore across the book. You know, some of the things that we are au fait with, some of the things that have become part of our norm, like voice recognition technology, you know, haven't been able to take off for years because we've the folks that are building the technology haven't necessarily considered the fullness of perhaps Scottish and Irish accents, which means that something like Siri is still doesn't understand those with the fantastic Scottish or Irish accent. There's a great YouTube video called Two Scots in a Voice Activated Elevator. Spoiler alert, they go nowhere. Or whether it's seatbelts and airbags, which famously early iterations killed women and children, which was the opposite of what those engineers and technologists had been tasked with doing. I love talking to audiences about periods, the menopause and pregnancy, and the fact that every couple of years the tech industry seems to discover the period for the very first time, with often frustrating, if you want, comical effects. Most recently, 4 years ago, one huge health tech company discovered the period for the very first time and built a period tracker that only lasted 10 days, only allowed you to track 10 days. And I'll let you decide, or let some of you evaluate why that might have been a useful or not so useful thing to have discovered 4 years ago and built 4 years ago with a lot of effort, having never ever spoken to someone, presumably never spoken to someone who's had a period before, or even met anyone that's had a period before. And bottom right, this is an example from a tech company not too long ago, image recognition, that's been able to successfully identify skyscrapers, successfully identify airplanes. Yes, they are cars. Yes, they are bikes. No, they are not gorillas. And yes, that is a graduation. And the solution to that as a tech problem is not to remove the tag gorillas from the image recognition technology. And so there's so much for us to learn, there's so much for us to engage with, but even more so, I think a lot of this comes from lots of lessons that we haven't learned, but also an obscured history that we have, but there's a lot of erasure that we've seen of the stories of the people that have been before. And so the subheading in my book is how women can take back tech, with the implication that this is a space that actually lots of different people over the years to have created this version of the future that we're living in, with their imaginations, with their creations, and with their involvement with technology. And so it's important in taking control, in taking control, and building technology that leaves the right kind of legacy, rather than leads us to the robot apocalypse, to ensure that we are aware of these stories and we're understanding of the differences that we have across the world, and we're including that in the way that we make technical decisions. And that involves having non-technologists and those who aren't classically trained or haven't done their GCSEs age 2 in the way that we run the tech world and that we see it. And so many of these, I'm hoping you recognise some of these faces, but if you do pick up the book, these are some of the stories and women and influential people who, you know, we've got Wi-Fi here on this screen, we've got Kevlar, who we should be able to reflect on. And so I wanted to leave you a little bit of kind of, as you heard there from Jack, actually, the book is incredibly practical. So I wanted to leave you 4 things for you to consider on your journey, on your technical journey, as you learn, you engage, and as you are alive in this version of the future. The first is to have a growth mindset about this. There's a lot to learn, there's a lot to have, but the point isn't to learn it all or to be the expert in all of the technology. It's just to have a growth mindset, to know more this week than you knew last week, more next month than you knew last month, more this year than you knew last year, and to continually maybe experiment with going just outside your comfort zone to see where the magic might happen for you in your life beyond your tech journey. Second is to see this as a series of experiments, as an iterative process, as something where you build, you try something out, you measure, and then you learn. And I think that's something for us to be able to lean into, even more so as non-technologists, that this isn't about getting it right the first time round, but it is about iterating, it is about having a direction of travel, and it's about experiments, which means that we don't always know what the right answer is going to be or the outcome is going to be when we begin. Thirdly, is to ensure that we're intentionally including always, rather than unintentionally excluding. And in the book, I'm talking about women, but also there are lots of different types of people and lots of different things that make us who we are, whether it's a background in the arts, whether it's an appreciation for perms, as we have from Elle there in Legally Blonde, or whether it's actually just in the fact that a lot of the technology that we engage with is not used in one locale and in one society and by the people that we see and that we know, but it actually has influence way, way beyond where we are and who we are. And that takes me to my final point, which is to recognise and use your influence, not being classically trained, being an artist, being someone who felt like their maths lessons weren't fantastic, doesn't mean that there's not anything of value that you can contribute to a lot of the technology that is shaping our lives, informing the way that the world is at the moment. And so each of us has a sphere of influence. Each of us is able to follow some of those other things, grow, learn, iterate and experiment, and actually really have an influence on this rollout of technology, so that we're not at the whims, we're not at the beck and call, we're not at the mercy of technology in the way that it's being played out at the moment. And so that's hopefully less than 15 minutes from me on how to tech control. I've got a newsletter out that folks can join as well if they'd like to hear maybe monthly ponderings on this and what it might mean for them. Thank you very much, Jack, and thanks for having me at all of this. I will see you all soon.
Anne-Marie, thank you so much. That was such an inspiring way to kick off the show this evening, and great to have those practical how-tos as well. Our second speaker tonight is Tom Moorhouse, a conservation research scientist who's worked for 20 years at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford University's Biology Department. Tom's work focuses on the conservation of water voles and hedgehogs, as well as the impact of wildlife tourism. He's the author of Elegy for a River and works of award-winning children's fiction. Tonight, he's here to tell us about hedgehogs and the story behind his latest book, Ghosts in the Hedgerow.
Thanks, Jack. So yes, this is indeed a talk about hedgehogs. It's about why there aren't nearly as many of them in Britain as there used to be. It's also about how the same problems that face British hedgehogs also drive a huge proportion of global biodiversity loss. And importantly, this is a talk about why I believe that realization can actually be a source of hope and optimism. So this is the task I've set myself. In the 11.5 minutes remaining to me, I shall guide you on a whirlwind voyage that shall carry you from British hedgehogs to global conservation and then back to your own garden and your own fridge. And now I come to say that out loud, it does all sound a bit ambitious. So yeah, good luck everyone. We're going in. Next slide, please. So hopefully in a second, yeah. This is a hedgehog. It's a relatively small, pretty omnivorous insectivore, which means that while it specializes in eating crawly and slithery things like beetle larvae and worms, it will also happily eat eggs and some vegetable matter, and of course any cat or dog food left out by generous homeowners such as yourselves. Hedgehogs are highly mobile, which means that getting any sort of accurate count of their numbers is incredibly difficult. So unfortunately, the best data we have on what's happening to them in Britain comes from hedgehogs that have been run over by cars, which is terrible, but at least they have the advantage of staying still for long enough to be counted in surveys. And what these car survey data are suggesting is a species in steep decline, that we've lost 70% of our hedgehogs in the last 30 years. Now, there are many factors that contribute to this decline. The cars are an obvious one. In any given year, we lose several hundreds of thousands of hedgehogs on the road, which is a lot, but the biggest cause of their decline probably isn't cars. In fact, it's almost certainly what's on the next slide, please. So you probably weren't expecting a foray into astronomy here, but bear with me. What you're looking at is the average distance between the Earth and the Moon. And did you know that you can fit all of the planets of the solar system into that distance? Next slide, please. Before I started writing my book, Ghosts in the Hedgerow, I didn't know this, but apparently it's true. How is this relevant to hedgehogs? Well, because on this scale, next slide, This green line represents the total amount of hedgerow that Britain removed in 50 years between 1940 and 1990. That is about 600,000 kilometres, enough to get you to the moon and most of the way back. The hedgerows were removed as part of agricultural intensification, the post-war drive to make British farming more productive and efficient, which it did, but at a cost. The name hedgehog is a clue to why that might have been a bad thing. Hedgehog is not a joke name. Hedgehogs are small, snuffly mammals that very superficially resemble tiny pigs, and they're heavily dependent on hedgerows. Hedges provide them with nesting sites, shelter from being predated on by badgers. They're warmer than the surrounding agricultural fields, and importantly, harbour an amazing diversity and abundance of the invertebrate prey that hedgehogs need to eat. You remove a hedge, you've removed hedgehogs' food, shelter, principal method of moving around the countryside, all in one hit. And we removed 600,000 kilometres of prime hedgehog habitat. That alone makes the decline in their numbers completely unsurprising. But agricultural intensification also came with a huge reliance on herbicides and pesticides and heavy farm machinery. Next slide, please. As you can see, the amount of pesticide and the total area being sprayed has just gone up and up and up. And the result of this has been the wholesale loss of farmland invertebrates. When I was a kid, 30 something years ago, one of my pocket money jobs was cleaning dead insects off the car after a journey. I can't remember the last time I had to do that because cars are just hitting fewer insects. And that is not because aerodynamics have improved, it's because aerial invertebrates are vanishing at a horrific rate. There was a study in Germany across 63 nature reserves that estimated the total combined weight of insects fell by 3/4 in the 30 years before 2016. And that's pretty much because the insects were moving out of the reserves where they were being measured into the surrounding agricultural land and dying there. And a study in Denmark showed exactly the same thing, about 80% decline in flying insects in 20 years up to 2007. And that study went further by showing that the decline in insects was matched by a decline in house martins, barn swallows, sand martins, all birds that eat insects. And the same is true again in North America, which is estimated to have lost 3 billion birds in 50 years, just under a third of all the birds the country was able to support in the 1970s. They're gone. And the worst hit birds were the insectivores, exactly the same as hedgehogs. So basically, you would not want to be a snuffly insectivore living on modern British farmland. Okay, kind of a bad example. You don't want to be a snuffly insectivore anyway, but if you're given the option of being one now or being one in the 1930s, you would massively prefer to be an insectivore in the 1930s prior to agricultural intensification. Agricultural intensification is a huge driving force behind biodiversity loss the world over. In 2016, a study examined 8,700 species on the red list of threatened species, the internationally recognized standard for evaluating different species' risk of extinction. The greatest threat was overexploitation stemming from logging. That's, unsurprising. The second greatest was the conversion of wildlife habitats into agricultural land, coupled with the intensification of existing agriculture, the piling on of herbicides, insecticides to get more calories out of every square meter. Agricultural conversion and intensification imperiled 2/3 of all the threatened species examined. So what has happened to British hedgehogs is one example among millions of species worldwide. The result of this in Britain for hedgehogs has been to shove hedgehogs a long way down the road to becoming an exclusively urban species. They are now found most commonly in parks and gardens, where they're less likely to get nobbled by a badger, it's warmer, there are better nesting sites, and there's a lot more food available. But even in our gardens here, they're not safe because of the urban equivalent of agricultural intensification, which is called urban intensification. Now, urban intensification happens when green spaces in cities are developed into housing. Sure, we've seen that happening all around us. And what that does is it removes habitats for wildlife and it fragments existing populations of animals, making it more difficult for them to move around and so more isolated. But it also happens when individual homeowners become increasingly tidy-minded. Next slide, please. And that is happening a lot. Every bit of decking, every concrete base for a shed, every beautifully cropped lawn, every patio stand of artificial grass is again taking wildlife habitat that used to exist and rendering it utterly useless. And that is why hedgehogs are declining even in our towns and cities, because we are literally tidying them to death. This picture right here is hedgehog anathema. There are no flowers, there are no shrubs, there are no untidy patches where we could find invertebrates. There is no way for a hedgehog to even get into either of these gardens. In terms of supporting British wildlife, they're useless. Nationally, we have about 23 million gardens covering something like 4,300 square kilometres of the country. Even if we ignore things like playing fields and parks, which can be really important hedgehog habitats, they're full of worms, our gardens on their own could support between 40,000 and 140,000 hedgehogs, but only if they can get into them in the first place. So, okay, this all sounds very gloomy, and I talked about hope and optimism, but I honestly believe that what I've just described should be a source of optimism for everyone. It's really tempting to feel helpless when you're faced with even one of our sort of beloved species disappearing, let alone millions upon millions that are threatened globally. I'm a conservation researcher. I feel this every single day. But then I remember hedgehogs are a wild animal that voluntarily come into our garden. What we do as individuals in our own home affects them deeply. And the same is true for many, many species. If we want to be part of a solution that helps wildlife, both locally and globally, I'm suggesting we have 3 very, very easy things we can do. First, open up your garden to wildlife. Next slide, please. Remember that your gardens, even if right in the center of a city, they're home to wild creatures, from invertebrates up to large mammals and birds of prey. If you want hedgehogs to visit, cut a hole in each fence panel about the size of a CD case, and that will let them in. If you want them to have food when they do visit, leave some untidy patches, a little pile of logs, some wildflowers. Next slide, please. Observe no mow may. Aim for a garden that looks a bit like this. Immediately, the abundance of wildlife in your garden will shoot up, and that takes less work than keeping your garden tidy. Rather than mowing the lawn, have a cup of tea. Do that twice, you're helping wildlife more. And for me, these gardens look infinitely more lovely. Next slide, please. This is the Barbican Centre in the middle of London, and it's thriving with wildlife that keep kids fascinated. So that's step 1. Step 2, pass it on. Explain to your neighbours why your garden looks like this. Tell them it looks beautiful. Encourage them to do the same. More and more people are understanding that we should just be giving over a little patch of our gardens to wildlife. If we all do it, it'll be great. Third, if you're concerned by the loss of global biodiversity, make 1 or 2 easy changes to your diet. Because, as we've heard, agricultural intensification is a key driver of species loss, and a main driver of agricultural intensification globally is demand for meat, especially red meat. If everyone in the world replaced only 1 in 5 of their beef meals with mycoprotein, or corn to you and me, that would halve the projected rate of global forest loss by 2050. By 2050, it would halve it. It would also slow down climate change by reducing global methane emissions by about 10%. And if we all halve the amount of beef we eat, it would reduce deforestation and methane emissions by 80%. It's a small change. It will benefit your health, it will save you money, and it will prevent a huge number of global extinctions. You don't have to give anything up, just reduce meat consumption a little bit. So next slide please. When I came to write the concluding chapter of my book on hedgehogs, Ghosts in the Hedgerow, I honestly found a new source of optimism, because these things are easy. Even for people like me, I've got a small child and 2 jobs. Leave a few wildlife patches in your garden, cut some holes to help hedgehogs, eat a bit less meat, talk to other people and get them involved. And people do want to be involved, especially if it will help hedgehogs. I'm already seeing changes in our collective behavior. I see people up and down my street getting involved in No Mo May. So if you want to help hedgehogs and an abundance of other wildlife, it's something you can do at home. It'll cost you less time and money than you're currently spending. And if that's all you do, you're still being a magnificent part of the solution. The more people get involved, the greater the benefit for everyone. Thank you.
Tom, thank you so much for giving us that optimism, and again for those action points as well. I love the idea of the Hedgehog Highway. Our third speaker tonight is Ariel Bruce, a qualified social worker who's worked in post-adoption services for the last 35 years. Ariel's work brings social work practice together with tracing missing family members, and it's led her to be known as the Agatha Christie of the adoption world. Ariel carries out extensive work in many countries, helping to reunite families around the globe. She works on ITV's programme Long Lost Family, and she's the lead social search and social work consultant for the spin-off series Born Without Trace, which focuses on foundlings and recently won a BAFTA and a Rose d'Or award. She's here to talk to me tonight about that work. Ariel, thank you so much for being with us. I thought we might start by talking about your experience in this area. You've been working in post-adoption and social work and searching for a long time. And I wanted to hear about sort of what's changed during your career in this area.
Thanks, Jack. Yes. So you're right. I've worked in this area for nearly 40 years. I started as a qualified social worker, and I was sort of fascinated really by the culture that existed when I started work. I worked with a lot of social workers who had been very busy placing children for adoption. I came into social work, and at the time I did, very much as a sort of feminist, and I saw adoption itself as a feminist issue. What I saw was, and what I reflected upon of previous behaviour, had been that adoption was how we punished women who had transgressed the social mores of the day. We took their children. They did not have either social status, often money or a place to live, or a family that supported them. And we gave their children to those who were respectable, dare I say, very often church-going, had 2 bedrooms or more, and a reasonable income. And I saw adoption in a very sort of in that way. So when I started work, I came in with, to some extent, a view that the change in legislation in 75, which had enabled adopted people to find their families of origin, was really interesting, and that it was now bringing about, by the time I came into that world, real change in attitudes. So that was sort of my background, and I think that was the ethos I brought into the work I did. I guess that it then goes without saying that if you're going to come in with that view, you need practical skills, and the practical skills that I required was that I was able to trace people, because it was no good an adopted person coming to me and saying, you know, I have a sense of dislocation, of anomie in the world, and I need to find my family of origin and at least understand that, unless I could help to trace. So I started kind of fusing together both social work practice with tracing skills. And very recently, actually, I was very struck by something that Ruby Wax said in an interview. And she said, I'd come to realize in later life that I didn't need therapy, I needed genealogy. And I thought I was really struck by it. So it chimed very much with, I guess, my own work experience.
And when you were developing those skills, and I mean, in developing those skills and working with those people, you're giving people a sense of identity through genealogy, right? When you began to do that, where would you go looking? How do you retrace these links between families?
Well, I mean, traditionally, of course, one is using public records. I mean, that is the obvious thing. You're using, old electoral rolls, and you're using information about births, marriages, and deaths. Today, those things are on computer. They weren't in those days. And often I would end up going and visiting areas and talking to neighbours and anything that I could possibly do. But it also meant developing skills in other countries and learning how to search in other countries. I guess also having some instinct about social norms within certain groups. I mean, for example, a very simple example is that many women came from Ireland to England to have babies. What I grew to understand about the Irish diaspora was that they didn't own property. They didn't put their stamp on everything as the middle classes do. You know, they weren't on the electoral roll. They didn't own property. They went from job to job. Very transient, very difficult to trace. But if I went back to Ireland, to the village where they came from, the folk knowledge and history back 50 years in people's memories. So, you know, you just learn to search in a different way.
And that must have changed a lot now with the advent of mass DNA testing, right? I mean, how do you use that when there is no paper trail, when you're seeking to find people for whom, you know, there is no obvious record?
Well, I think that's been for me, I mean, you know, after all these years, that's been the most exciting development in recently. So just to go back, of course, when a person came to me and said, I don't know who my father is, I have never had a name for him, very usual on adopted persons' birth certificates, or my birth mother gave entirely false information. I can't find anybody of that name with that description. Or I'm a foundling. I'm left, you know, in a railway carriage. I'm left in a parked car. I'm left on church steps. You know, the stuff of literature from Superman to Moses, you know, Heathcliff. I mean, literature is completely filled with foundlings. They're the stuff of our dreams in many ways. You know, they are the ultimate self-made person, self-created person of our times, and probably of ever. I couldn't help those people, and that made me rather cross, actually. You know, I don't like that sort of thing. I don't like failure, and so about 7 years ago, it became apparent to me that there was a tipping point in the number of people who were taking who were doing DNA in order to understand something about their genetic heritage. And it was quite crude in those days. The way that these DNA sites like Ancestry work are that they refine their information based on the numbers of people that buy their kits. So today, across about 5 organizations, 4 of which coordinate with each other, there are about 30 or 35 million people who have taken tests. Now, if a person comes to me as a foundling, has no idea of their origin, and I put their DNA across those sites, the people that show to have a connection, and the connection is measured, might only be, when I say only, there might be third cousins. That means they share a great-great-great-grandparent. But somebody who understands genealogy can extrapolate from what they see and what they know to that which they don't know. If you can give me that, I can trace somebody's birth father or birth mother without them being themselves on having taken a test, or indeed their children, or possibly even their parents, or indeed their brothers and sisters. It could be more distant than that, but I can work through to do that. It is extraordinary, and of course it is fraught with moral dilemmas on lots and lots of levels, and there are many areas in which it will continue to be used. But for foundlings, this has been an extraordinary breakthrough. For me personally, it feels like the sort of last bit that I couldn't do that I've now been able to do for the people for whom I work.
That's incredible. And as you say, it opens up so many possibilities as well as dilemmas. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about some of the challenges of that work, that you must have been faced with scenarios that have been difficult to navigate kind of in ethical ways or personal ways.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it goes without saying that when we find living birth parents of children who have been left, it is so complicated. And we have to tread with the greatest of care. I mean, my overall picture of the circumstances in which children are left in those ways is inevitably it is a woman who is in a state of distress, whether it's economic distress, social, you know, a lack of social support. It could be religious, you know, being in a world that would frown hugely upon her having a child. There will be all very young or completely overwhelmed by already too many family responsibilities. And often these children are left very safe. I mean, classically, and the one I'm going to talk about, the child was left warmly wrapped with a warm bottle and a packet of formula milk, and watched until the child was taken away from the phone box. So, you know, these are can be acts which are not, while they're desperate, they are as kindly towards the child as can be. So this particular case, it was one that we worked on. I'm really very happy to have solved it. A man came to us, in fact, quite interesting. He had seen something I'd written, and he'd been brought up in Northern Ireland. His story was that 50 something years ago, he'd been found in an open car, with the door open, out in a suburban house, outside a suburban house in just outside Belfast. And he had been taken from there. Nobody knew who he was, and he'd been adopted. He'd gone into the British Army and served as a soldier. And during that time, he had made appeals on television in Ireland, desperate to know who he was. And when Kate Adie wrote a book called Nobody's Child about foundlings, he features in that as David. David then came to me and said, could I help? And we worked through the DNA. And we started work on this. And it is very complex, and in Ireland particularly, because in fact, the uptake in DNA kits is mostly in America, where the diaspora has gone, which is kind of interesting in itself. So anyway, we worked very hard at it, and eventually we got to the story. And the story was both his birth parents were dead. His birth father had been a married man. His birth mother, his long-term lover, girlfriend, whatever you want to call her, 40 years, according to the man's family, he had known this woman, 40 years. And our client, David, was a result of that relationship. So we were able to find photographs and all sorts of things. The woman never married, but the father was married. There were many children on that side, and they've been prepared to talk to David, tell him about their father, their collective father. And David is very much more settled. However, something really extraordinary happened as we were coming to the end of this extraordinary search. Somebody else took a test, and that somebody else was a full sister. They'd had another child who, again, the MO was identical, left in a phone box, properly looked after with a bottle, but this time in Southern Ireland. Because in fact, interestingly, the couple, the man and the woman, one was a Catholic and one was a Protestant. This time they left the child in the south. So David brought up as a Protestant, and his full sister, Helen, was brought up as a Catholic. I hasten to add, they decided that these things didn't matter. And then something else happened. The film was shown in Australia, and a woman living in Australia caught a snippet, and she thought she recognized something about her own father, himself a foundling. And he was the child born between David and Helen. So now we had three. So this relationship, of course, a culture of not using perhaps birth control, they had babies, and they left them because she could not have been seen to be a single woman bringing up a family, and he could not be seen to leave his family and his wife. So, you know, extraordinary stories that they resonate on every level. They're they are kind of, they're historic documents of a bygone time, a bygone set of ideals about family, a bygone set of moralities, and how people sort of escaped them or circumnavigated them. But for the people involved, the representation of actually both belonging somewhere and not just, as it were, having just growed, come from nowhere, has been, I think, very profound. So that's a little vignette. I learn a great deal, both about human nature, and also about these extraordinary searches as I go along.
Ariel, that's an extraordinary story. So many twists and turns, and thank you so much for sharing that with us tonight and for talking about your fascinating work.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Thanks, Ariel. Our fourth speaker this evening is the brilliant author and journalist Angela Saini, who is no stranger to 5x15. Angela presents radio, podcasts, and television programmes, and her writing has appeared across the world, including in the Financial Times, Wired, and National Geographic. Her 2019 book, Superior, The Return of Race Science, was published to enormous critical acclaim and became a finalist for numerous prizes, including Foyle's Book of the Year. In her bold and radical fourth book, The Patriarchs, Angela goes in search of the true roots of gendered oppression. She's joining us tonight from New York to talk about that work. Angela, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here again and to hear everybody else's incredible stories. I've learned much more about hedgehogs than I knew possible, and Ariel's story was just incredible. The origins of patriarchy is possibly one of the biggest topics you can take on as a nonfiction writer, and you know, I'm told that repeatedly. In fact, it's been a few months since my book came out, and there's rarely a day when someone doesn't email me or say to me, have you heard about this matrilineal community in Africa or Asia, or how come you didn't mention this historical example? There's just so much there. The evidence is immense. It stretches back right into the mists of time, and of course all over the world. So I had to be very selective in what I wrote, and always I was serving this basic question: how did men come to rule? How did men come to have so much power? I really wish the answer could be summarized in just a few minutes, because I would do that if I could. But in truth, like all aspects of human life, it's more complicated than that. If there's one thing I've learned writing about human difference over the last decade or so, it's that we never stand still as a species. We're always changing, we're always adapting and moving, and we're always in constant social conflict, because every single one of us as individuals has a different idea of what makes an ideal society. You know, we talk about equality as though this is something everyone wants automatically, that this must be something everybody wants. But I'm not entirely sure that that's true. Many people, and in fact, I wonder sometimes if it's most people, actually want for themselves a little bit more power, or a little bit more wealth, or a little bit more influence or status. We all want a tiny bit more than the people next to us. And this is why every human society isn't perfectly equal. It's a patchwork of all these desires that we have and the particular historical struggles that these individual desires have created. Patriarchy isn't universal. It's certainly not timeless. There is a history that we can paint there. And I want to start just by painting you a bit of that story that I cover in my book. And I'm going to show you some photos now that I took in 2020. One of the first things I did when I started researching the patriarchs was to travel to Çatalhöyük. There were a couple of little windows in 2020 during the pandemic when we were allowed to travel. And as soon as we were, I went to southern Anatolia, to this very ancient settlement. And I apologize here because these photos are going to feel like your parents showing you their holiday snaps. I'm not a very good photographer, and they do have a holiday snap quality. I apologize for that in advance. But this site, which you can see me standing in front of, was excavated in the 1960s. And when it was described as the first city on Earth. And the reason archaeologists said that was that this is 9,000 years old. So that's 5,000 years before the first pyramids went up in Egypt. It's more than 4,000 years before Stonehenge was built. It predates written language by a very long way. So this is unimaginably old. This is one of the earliest settlements, human settlements, that we have evidence from anywhere in the world. And archaeologists have tried to recreate the interior here, and you can see this is a recreation based on what they found at the site. And you can see that it is recognizable to modern human eyes. When you're in there, you get this sense that this could be a modern day home in some societies today. There are you can see there's a hearth where people would have cooked. There are platforms where people would have slept and sat. One of the big differences is that even though there is a window there, actually there wouldn't have been windows or doors. What happened was there was a hole in the ceiling and a ladder. So the ladder you can see at the back, that is how people would have come in and out of their houses, going through these ladders and kind of conducting their business on the top of houses rather than in between houses, through pavements and roads like we do today. But there was these beautiful artworks on the wall as well. You can see here in the next slide, I'll show you just really arresting, vivid red frescoes on these beautifully whitewashed walls, showing vultures feasting on dead bodies, hunting scenes. You can see that there was possibly a cult of the ancestor here because people's bodies were very carefully buried and handled within their own homes. So they would have been buried in platforms underneath the floors on which they slept. And sometimes their skulls were disinterred and then passed around between each other. Sometimes they were plastered, these skulls, and then moved around. So it's an incredibly culturally and socially complex site in which there were very complex human relations that we can't have much of an insight into because, like I said, this predates written language. So all we have really is the site to go on and what we have left there in terms of archaeological evidence. But what we can know is that women weren't invisible here. There are countless female figurines that have been found at Çatalhöyük, this site, but also right across that region. So this is very near the Fertile Crescent, where some of the world's earliest civilizations flourished. And we see lots of female figurines, and this is one of the most famous. This is in one of the museums in Anatolia now, and I was very lucky to see it firsthand. It's an incredibly famous figurine. I'm sure some of you will have seen pictures of it before, but you can see that it depicts what looks to be an older woman, her body possibly weathered by age, because you can see these very deep indentations in her skin and these beautiful rolls of fat kind of spilling out all around her. And then on either side of her outstretched hands, you can see are what look to be big cats or leopards looking straight ahead, almost as though she had tamed these animals. So here is a woman, her back completely straight, quite an authoritative position that she's maintaining there. And in fact, when the seated woman of Çatalhöyük was discovered, she was described as a goddess. In the 1960s, people thought that this was a representation of a goddess, although modern day archaeologists think that perhaps she was a real person, that maybe she was an older woman who had been depicted in this way. It's very difficult to say. We can't know for sure. But what we do know is that women weren't invisible, because there are many more figurines like this. And in fact, every archaeological measure we have of gender difference, and there are lots of ways in which archaeologists can measure gender difference, because we have things like we can look at human remains and understand the wear and tear on the body, the kind of things people ate, whether there was any trauma experienced by that person. Every single measure tells us that men and women at Çatalhöyük lived very similar lives. In terms of what they ate very similar foods. The work that they did very similar work. They spent around the same amount of time indoors and outdoors. They were buried in very similar ways, which is a big indicator of social inequality, because high status people, especially in sites like this where there may have been a cult of the ancestor, high status people tend to get buried in more elaborate ways. And what we see is that's not the case, that men and women are buried very similarly. If there is one difference, this is what the archaeologist Ian Hodder told me, it's that the women tended to be buried with a few more beads than the men tended to be buried with. But in every respect, and this is what the lead archaeologist there told me, this was a site in which gender just didn't matter very much. Which leaves us with a very big question. If this is what it was like 9,000 years ago, if gender didn't matter very much to people 9,000 years ago, at least in this region of the world, and certainly we don't have very much evidence in the rest of the world that gender was a huge impact on how people lived, then when and why did things change? Why did things become more patriarchal later on? And we know that they did in this region. This is modern day Turkey now that we're talking about. So spanning Asia, Africa, Middle East, this entire region, we know that things change. We know that by antiquity, for instance, people were living very different lives. You look at ancient Athens, and here is a society that's deeply misogynistic, in which the literature itself betrays this huge suspicion of women, a fear of women, and a hatred in some cases. Now, it's sometimes assumed that the big turning point between the Neolithic, when this is, and antiquity could have been agriculture, because agriculture requires body strength, and it's also when people started to accumulate property. And property was important, according to some theorists, because this was when men started to want to make sure that their property would be passed on to their legitimate heirs and not to anybody else. So they were very protective over women's sexuality from that point on. But actually, it's long after the development of agriculture that we start to see rules and laws restricting the lives and freedoms of women. And in fact, women everywhere have been involved in agriculture and done heavy manual agricultural work right throughout the history of time, and they still do. And I'll stop sharing now, where we really start to see the big signs of gender depression is with the development of the earlier states. So when the world's first states emerged in regions like ancient Mesopotamia, the biggest challenge they faced was population. How to keep large numbers of people within their borders and not have them leave and run away, because they could have gone and went and been hunter-gatherers or done something else. How do they keep them within the state, producing a surplus for those elites at the top? And that drove an interest in the family, inexorably. You can imagine that if you care about population, you have to care what happens in the family. And that led to a state preoccupation with birth rates and with defense. How do we keep people having enough children? And how do we make sure that families are loyal enough to give up their children to fight and defend the state if they need to, sometimes give up their lives for the state if necessary? And we still see that now. That's still a feature of modern states. Anywhere in the world, whenever birth rates start to fall, states get nervous, governments get nervous. You can see this in China today. even though the one-child policy has been lifted, there is still this nervousness in the state that women still aren't having enough children. You can see it here in the United States, arguably, over the tussle over reproductive rights. That's possibly a byproduct of this concern that populations might fall. None of this happened in a sudden sweeping way. It wasn't as though the state appeared and then everything changed. It happened gradually over thousands of years, that these two twin preoccupations of birth rates and defense came to define the patriarchal state and the way that laws were organized around it, the way that religions and the establishment of religion bought into this idea of the patriarchal state. And that really, I would argue, and I do argue in my book, that is how the first patriarchal states first emerged. This history is a reminder that human oppression of all kinds, including gender oppression, is something that was invented and developed. And I would argue we can still see it now. It's still being reinvented and reasserted in the present. Thank you.
Angela, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating and such a powerful lesson about learning from the past and some of the things that can be taken for granted about patriarchy. Thank you. Our final speaker this evening is Andrew Motion, who is the Poet Laureate in the UK from 1999 to 2009, and he's now the Homewood Professor in the Arts at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Andrew is the co-founder of the online Poetry Archives, and he has written acclaimed biographies of Philip Larkin and John Keats, among others. His memoir, In the Blood, was published in 2006, and its sequel, Sleeping on Islands, A Life in Poetry, is published this week. It tells the story of his remarkable career, over 50 years being close to the centres of British poetry, and he's here to tell us about that tonight. Andrew, we're delighted to have you. Thank you for being with us.
I'm very pleased to be here, Jack. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to Stephanie, and thank you everybody listening, and thank you everybody who's been talking to your hard acts to follow. In fact, so hard to follow that because I found myself becoming so absorbed in what you were saying, that when I combine that with my natural preference for writing, not talking, I've realized that I'm facing some obstacles in the next 15 minutes, but here goes. As you say, Jack, my book recently published, or at least about to be published this week, is a memoir. But in fact, it's not the first memoir that I've written. And this is where I should begin, I think, by saying that in 2006, I published a book about my childhood called In the Blood, which takes the story is quite the word for it, of my life from the age of nothing to 17, at which point in my life my mother suffered a very serious accident, which, because it was so serious, acted as a kind of bookend for that part of my life. And ever since I finished that book now many years ago, I've been toying with the idea of writing a sequel to it and bringing the story up to date. But I realized every time I tried to do such a thing that the procedures that had served me in the first instance probably wouldn't work very well second time round. And in particular, what I found myself thinking was that whereas I'd written the first book in the historic present, so as to give a kind of freshness to what I was writing about, as though in some sense my childhood was still happening to me, that method wouldn't really work for a description of adult life or a representation of adult life. The advantage I hoped with the method was that in the first book, it allowed for a kind of intimacy, as I say, but the cost of that intimacy was to deny me the room, the space in which to reflect. I was simply immersed in this series of moments. I didn't feel that that was an appropriate way to write about my later life, not so much because I felt that I had a thesis to develop or an argument to follow. I rather didn't have any of those things, but because I thought that that kind of lack of self-awareness implied by what I've said about the first book would be something that looked approximately like deceit or avoidance in the second book. So after throwing away about 100 pages of efforts at beginning this second book, Sleeping on Islands, considering for quite a long time whether to put it in the third person in order to give myself a kind of objective stance, rejecting that because it seemed too confusing and also too cold. I plunged in, writing the book in a series of short scenes, some of which I hope approximate to the condition of prose poems, but some of them more narrative driven, rather like the relationship, in fact, between aria and recitative in opera. That was the idea roughly in my mind. So no historic present, just a retrieval of the past, and these, as I say, these short scenes. It begins more or less at the point where In the Blood, the previous book gave up, which is to say there's a short account of the end of my life at home. I was brought up in what was then rural Essex. My father was a brewer. My mother didn't go out to work and was so often ill, even before her accident, that she wouldn't have found it at all easy to hold down a job, I don't think, in a permanent way. It was a happy childhood, apart from the things that were happening to my mum, but it was also one in which there were no, or next to no, books. It was simply not my parents' interest to read, and there was absolutely no expectation that my own life would end up having so much to do with books. My father used to claim that he'd read half a book in his life, and I know what it was. It was a so-called thriller. Somebody must have told him it was a thriller, but it was obviously not very thrilling to him since he only read half of it. A so-called thriller called The Lonely Skier by Hammond Innes. I remember my father bringing it on holiday for several years, actually, and impatiently flicking over the pages while it rained and then gratefully throwing it aside when the rain stopped. My mother read a little bit more than that when she was able to. I think she was a member of a book club. I remember her fishing, as it were, the new Iris Murdoch out of jiffy bags. So there were books around, but as I say, this was not a priority or a particular interest. They thought of themselves as country people doing country things, which in their case didn't include reading. In the corner of the sitting room, there was a device which we call the whirligig. Perhaps they really are called whirligigs, which was a kind of rotating bookcase, which had the books some of the books that they didn't read as stored in it. And one of them, because I think it was a school prize of my mother's, was the collected poems of Rupert Brooke, an unfashionable figure these days and not that fashionable at the time, but I was aware of that book. And in particular, I was aware of the rather glamorous photograph taken by Shell of him not wearing a shirt with his floppy fur hair at the beginning of the book. And it gave me, when I opened it, an idea of poetry being a rather sort of glamorous thing, but I left it at that, really. And then at the beginning of my A-level time at school, I fell under the spell of an absolutely wonderful, genius English teacher, a man called Peter Way, who walked very briskly into my mind and turned the lights on, made poems seem things which were part of life or could be part of life rather than weird additions to them, rather than simply sort of fancy ornaments. At which point the spectre of Rupert Brooke concentrated a little bit in my mind. And in my last summer holidays from school, and this is precisely the point at which this book begins, two friends and I went to look for Rupert Brooke's grave, which is on the island of Skiros as part of Greece. And the reason that he's buried there is that he died on the way to Gallipoli, where he would almost certainly have been killed had he not died en route. And a little boat was put down from the big boat on which he was traveling. And some friends of his in his regiment rowed him ashore, walked the body up the dry riverbed, which they found at their point of landing, and buried him in an olive grove. So these two friends and I set off overland. We took the train to Athens. We were, 17 years old? Took the train to Athens, took buses across and boats across to Skiros, and then walked to look for the grave, very nearly dying in the attempt, I must say, because we were so ill-prepared. When we got back to school, we boastfully put on a little talk with slides of our, as we thought of it, great adventure. And to that talk came not only the English teacher that I've mentioned and want to praise, but also the recently arrived headmaster of the school, a man called Dennis Silk, who was really more of a games player than an intellectual, as I think he would have admitted himself. And as part of his games playing life, he'd become friendly with Siegfried Sassoon, the First World War poet, then a very old man, of course, because Dennis Silk was a very good cricketer and Sassoon loved cricket, and they'd become friends through cricket. And through his friendship with Sassoon, dead by this time, Dennis wondered whether I'd like to meet a friend of Sassoon's called Geoffrey Keynes, Maynard's brother, Geoffrey, then also a very old man living just outside Cambridge, because Geoffrey had been a friend of Rupert Brooke's at school, and Dennis thought that it would be nice for me to go and talk to him about the condition of Brooke's grave and generally share my enthusiasm. And so I did. And because it turned out that Geoffrey lived quite near where my father was then living, it was easy for me to go and see him during the school holidays, which I began to do. And even though Geoffrey was 60 years older than me, I think, we became good friends. And really through his kindness and his extraordinary willingness to share the treasures that were heaped up in his house, paintings, books, conversation, I began to feel that a door was opening into the life that I, in the most sort of tentative way, was beginning to feel might be the one that I wanted to lead instead of the one that I'd been born into. So when the time came to go to university, I thought that English is what I would study at university. And I should perhaps say that nobody in my father's family anyway had been to university before, so this had a kind of a shock and novelty, sense of adventure value to it, for me at least. When I got to university, I read as voraciously as I possibly could. I felt, as I still feel, that I had a lot to make up for in terms of lost time. And one of the poets that I was spending a lot of time reading then was the great Northern Irish poet Louis MacNeice. And when I discovered that Louis MacNeice's long-term friend, E.R. Dodds, Eric Dodds, author of The Greeks and the Irrational, was still alive and living just outside Oxford with the brass neck of youth, I wrote to him and asked whether I could go and see him. And a friend and I did go and see him, and then we became friends. And through Dodds, I met, in the very last part of his life, W.H. Auden, who had returned to Oxford, at least for some of the last year of his life, because by that stage in his own existence, needed a bit of looking after. And Auden was kind to me, and we made an arrangement, he made an arrangement with me that once a week, through the fall of that year, which was the year before he died, I would take new poems and show them to him, and we would sit and talk about them, and so we did. And I've talked a little bit about that in the book. It seemed to me, and perhaps this is a theme that emerges through the book, that though I wouldn't have put it to myself like this at the time, that I was somebody who needed to move quite a long way from where I was born in order to be where I wanted to get, and that having mentors of a kind that I could admire and follow in a more or less unqualified way would help me make that transition. And Auden's kindness to me was a very important thing for me, in a sense of giving me permission as well as being inspiring. When I finished my time at university, I stayed at Oxford for a couple of years and did research on the poet Edward Thomas, who I was and am very keen on. And then it was time that I got my first job, and a job happened to come up at the University of Hull, where, as many of you listening know, for the last 30 years of his life, the university librarian was Philip Larkin. This was certainly an incentive for me to apply for a job in Hull, though of course Larkin did have the reputation of living very firmly as a hermit, so it never seemed very likely that we'd become friends, but against the run of play we did. And actually I think I have my father to thank for this, at least in the first instance, because Philip and I first met in the university staff bar in the days when people used to drink at lunchtime. And we were drinking beer, and which I never saw him do again. Philip took a huge swig of beer at some early point in our rather stilted conversation. And it went down the wrong way. So this person that I so looked up to, I was suddenly having to pound on the back and help him to get over his having gone down the wrong way, which in itself was a sort of oddly intimate way of being with him. And when he recovered from his coughing and spluttering, he began to ask me about my life and said, "What does your father do?" And I said that my father was a brewer. And I remember, and will until my own dying day, Philip's eyes lighting up and him saying, "A brewer," as though he decided on that evidence that I came from stock, which was worth bothering with, since it produced alcohol, rather than having anything to do with writing, which after all you can take or leave as you like. Anyway, I've worked in Hull for 3 years, and then I went back to Oxford. I took over as editor of the Poetry Review after living there for a couple of years, catching up with my writing. And then I went to work for the publishers Chatto and Windus. And at some point in this period, Philip came to see me in Oxford and asked me to become one of his literary executors, which I did, though wishing that he wouldn't die and expecting to have a very long period of not having to do any executive work. But as everybody knows, he died young, actually, even though he's had a rather valetudinarian manner in 1985. And then I set about writing his biography, encouraged to do this, in fact, asked to do this by his relic, Monica Jones, the dedicatee of his book, The Less Deceived. An extraordinary opportunity for me, though, of course, since I was fond of Philip and missed him, not one that I particularly wanted to take. I had written a biography of a family called Lambert up to that, but before that point, but really writing about Philip was a different order of things and required an enormous range of different ways of thinking to be brought together: philosophizing, literary scholarship, curiosity and sympathy with as many people as I could get to see, which was pretty much everybody that he knew as far as I was aware. And by the time my book came out, his reputation had changed rather, complicated a great deal, from being the nation's sort of favorite teddy bear poet to being somebody who, because of his views, was a much more complicated figure. I followed that book by writing about John Keats, and I've written a little bit about that in my book as well. And at some point after that, in 1995, I was appointed Poet Laureate. I split the job into two parts in my mind's eye. I split it into a doing part and a writing part. The doing part really consisted of setting up the Poetry Archive, which Jack was talking about. I wanted to leave a rock in the road behind me. I'd agreed to do it for 10 years, and I wanted to leave a rock in the road that would outlive my tenure. And the other bit was the writing bit, of course, which by precedent required me to write poems about events in the royal calendar, something that I've made no secret of finding very difficult to do because, well, for a variety of reasons, one of them being that my poems depend on having very strong feelings about the things that I'm writing about, and with the best will in the world, I was suddenly required to write about people that I'd never met and in many cases never did meet. So that was a complicated part of the job. When I stood down as laureate, I took on too many other things that of a sort of public nature for my own peace of mind. And then the opportunity came to come and teach at Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore, where I'm talking from now. T.S. Eliot says in one of the four quartets that old men ought to be explorers. I was 62, I think, when I came here. My wife and I simply put all our belongings in a gigantic metal container and sailed them across the Atlantic. It seems in hindsight a slightly braver thing to do than it felt at the time. I think I was so excited when we first moved here by the thought of coming that I didn't realize how bold / reckless a move it was. But I think it was one of the, in fact, I know it was one of the best things I've ever done in my life. It's allowed me much more time for my own work, which I'm very glad to have. And it's allowed me to stand under the great Niagara downpour of American poetry, which I hope is introducing my own writing to new influences and new things. So I miss my friends very much. I miss my family very much, and my children and their children especially, but I'm very glad to be here. And in fact, I've recently become an American citizen, a dual citizen with my British nationality. So I can't see myself leaving here in a hurry. So I suppose if I'm spared, there may be a third book in this What Happened to Me series, but for the time being, we're stuck at part 2. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a wonderful account of exploring and reading and of mentorship. Thank you for being with us tonight. And thank you to all of our speakers, Anne-Marie Imafidon, Tom Moorhouse, Ariel Bruce, Angela Saini, and Andrew Motion. Please do check out the other events we have coming up on our website, 5by15.com. Next week, we have a live in-person event at Fenwick Department Store on Monday, the 22nd of May. And next Wednesday, we have the second event in our panel series with Kew Gardens. This is a special online panel event about trees and forests. And we have Kathy Willis, Suzanne Simard, Joe Crowley, and Ed Eichen, director of Kew's Wakehurst site. It will be chaired by our own Rosie Boycott, so make sure not to miss that. All of our speakers' books are available from Newham Bookshop, so please do check out their details in the chat, and they'll be sent out to you tomorrow as well as a reading list. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Good evening.